Beijing, 1704. Inside a modest home, candlelight flickers across a wooden altar, and ancestral tablets line the shelf, names carved in characters representing generations of family honor. A Chinese Christian kneels. His hands rest on his thighs, incense smoke curls upward, thin and gray, and outside, the winter wind scrapes against the courtyard walls. Inside, though, it's silence, except for the faint crackle of burning incense. His grandfather's name is on one of those tablets. His father's name is on another. Every name represents a life, a legacy, a thread connecting past to present. To abandon this altar means severing those threads. To refuse the ritual means declaring his ancestors worthless, his family meaningless. In China, this isn't mere tradition, it's the foundation of civilization itself. It's Xiao, the moral order holding society together. But a letter exists. Somewhere, ink has dried on parchment. Somewhere, a seal has been pressed into wax. And somewhere, a decision has been made about this altar and this incense and this man's family. He just doesn't know it yet. The question that letter tries to answer is this: can a Christian honor ancestors without betraying Jesus? Can faith adapt to culture without compromise? Where is the line between respect and idolatry? Someone believes they know the answer. Someone has decided for him, and that decision, made thousands of miles away by men who've never smelled this incense or read these characters, is already crossing an ocean. What happens when theology written in Latin meets devotion lived in Mandarin? From the That's Jesus channel, welcome to Coach, where church origins and church history actually coach us how to walk boldly with Jesus today. I'm Bob Balch, and on Friday we stay between 1500 and 2000 AD. In this episode, we are in the year 1704 AD, and a papal decree is about to ignite a crisis that will close China to Christian missions for over a century. The story begins in 1583 when Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci arrived in China with a strategy no European missionary had attempted before. He didn't come to conquer, he came to learn. Ricci studied Mandarin until he could debate Confucian texts with Chinese scholars. He wore the robes of a literati. He taught astronomy, mathematics, and cartography, contributing to Chinese science while earning respect for himself. He didn't demand immediate conversion. He built relationships first. By the time Ricci died in 1610, Christian communities had taken root in Beijing, Nanjing, and Shanghai. The Jesuits had become imperial advisors, tutors to nobles, respected contributors to Chinese culture. Christianity wasn't foreign anymore, it was becoming Chinese. But the strategy required accommodation, and the flashpoint was ancestor veneration. In Chinese culture, honoring the dead wasn't optional. Families maintained ancestral tablets, wooden plaques inscribed with the names of deceased relatives. They offered food at household altars, burned incense, bowed in ritual gestures. This was Xiao, that was filial piety, the Confucian virtue of honoring parents and ancestors, and it was the moral foundation holding society together. Refusing to participate meant rejecting your family, rejecting your heritage, and rejecting your place in civilization itself. For most Chinese, abandoning ancestor rites wasn't a theological choice, it was social suicide. The Jesuits argued that these were not acts of worship. The tablets held no divine power. The incense wasn't an offering to spirits. The boughs did not petition the dead for favors. Chinese Christians were not praying to ancestors. They were simply honoring family memory through culturally meaningful gestures, no different from Europeans placing flowers on graves. Ricci had insisted, quote, "The gospel must be planted in the soil of culture," End quote. If believers couldn't participate in the rites, they would become outcasts. And outcasts don't evangelize, they hide. So for the Jesuits, accommodation was not compromise, it was wisdom. But by 1700, rival missionaries, they disagreed. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, they were arriving in China, and they looked at these same altars, the same incense, the same bowing, and they saw idolatry. Intent didn't matter, they argued. The altar was an idol. The ritual dishonored God. No amount of theological nuance could baptize paganism. The Dominicans sent reports to Rome accusing the Jesuits of syncretism, blending Christian faith with non-Christian practices, and they demanded that the Vatican intervene. Meanwhile, Emperor Kangxi, ruling since 1661, had become Christianity's greatest protector. He studied with Jesuit missionaries, he debated theology with them, and issued edicts protecting Christian communities. Under Kangxi, Christianity enjoyed unprecedented favor. But the question had reached Rome: were the Jesuits missionaries or were they compromisers? The Pope would have to decide, and his answer would determine whether the door to China would stay open or be slammed shut. By the 1690s, the controversy had moved from Chinese villages to the Vatican itself, where Pope Innocent XII faced a question with global stakes. If Chinese Christians could bow before ancestral tablets, what would that permit elsewhere? Could Indian converts wear caste marks? Could African believers participate in tribal ceremonies? Could European former pagans keep folk traditions? The ruling on China would ripple through every mission field in the world. And in 1693, Rome issued a cautious decree. Some Chinese rites might be acceptable if stripped of superstition. The answer was vague enough to satisfy no one. The Jesuits kept accommodating, the Dominicans kept protesting. The standoff continued until 1700, when Clement XI became Pope. Unlike his predecessor, Clement was decisive and deeply suspicious of Jesuit flexibility. He studied the Dominican testimonies and concluded that the Jesuits had compromised too far. The Dominicans had written, quote, "The rites are not merely civil customs, but contain elements fundamentally incompatible with Christian worship," end quote. Their argument was clear. Appearance mattered just as much as intent did. Even if Chinese Christians claimed no religious belief in the power of ancestors, the rituals themselves honored spirits and perpetuated practices that were rooted in a false theology. And Rome listened. On November 20th, 1704, Pope Clement XI issued his decree. Chinese Christians could not venerate ancestors. They could not maintain ancestral tablets. They could not participate in Confucian ceremonies honoring Confucius or the dead. The practices were idolatrous, incompatible with Christian worship. The decree went further. Missionaries could use only Tianzhu, Lord of Heaven, for God, forbidding alternative translations. Every missionary in China would swear an oath of obedience. The decree stunned the Jesuits. Years of patient strategy, learning the language, earning trust, building relationships, unraveled in a single papal sentence. But Rome had spoken. The Jesuits, bound by their vow of obedience, could not refuse. In 1705, papal legate Charles Thomas Maillard de Tournon arrived in Beijing carrying the decree, expecting diplomatic courtesy. Instead, he got fury. Emperor Kangxi didn't see theological clarity, he saw cultural arrogance. For 40 years, he had protected missionaries, he had studied with them, he had defended them. And now Rome was declaring that Xiao, the moral foundation of Chinese society, was pagan idolatry. The emperor's response was swift. If missionaries wanted to remain in China, they would obtain an imperial permit, Payao. To receive it, they had to affirm in writing that ancestral rites were civil customs and promise never to interfere with them. The Jesuits, caught between a papal decree and an imperial demand, mostly complied. They took the permits and they stayed. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, though, the ones who demanded that Pope intervene, they refused. They would not contradict the Pope. Kangxi began restricting missionaries who refused permits. Churches faced scrutiny. Christian gatherings drew suspicion. Conversions, once numbering thousands annually, slowed to a trickle as potential believers weighed the cost of joining a faith that rejected their families. The mission wasn't stalling, it was fracturing. Over the next decade, the situation deteriorated from crisis to just an all-around collapse. By 1710, Papal Legate Tournon was under house arrest in Macau, isolated and ill. He died there the same year, and his mission failed, his health broken. Kangxi, once Christianity's greatest protector in Asia, had become its obstacle. Missionaries without permits, they faced expulsion, and those who stayed lived under suspicion. In 1715, Pope Clement XI escalated the situation. He issued a papal bull making the 1704 condemnation official church teaching. No ambiguity remained. Ancestor veneration was absolutely forbidden. Jesuits who had accommodated were disciplined. The Jesuits made one final appeal, quote, "The same gesture can carry different meanings in different lands," end quote. That's what they insisted. Context mattered, they said. Intent mattered. A bow in China isn't the same as worship in Europe. Rome rejected the appeal. In 1742, Pope Benedict XIV issued the final word, confirming and extending the ban. The controversy was over. The church had spoken definitively, but the mission was also over. Christian communities across China faced an impossible choice: abandon faith or abandon family. Most chose family. Churches emptied. In 1724, just 20 years after the initial decree, Christianity was officially banned throughout China. Missionaries went underground or they fled altogether. The few who remained worked in secret, cut off from the communities that they'd spent decades building. The door Matteo Ricci had opened in 1583 with patience and friendship was slammed shut in 1724, and it stayed closed for over a century. The Jesuits accommodated to save the mission. Rome condemned to save the gospel. Both believed that they defended Jesus, and both lost China. The question revealed a tension that the church still navigates. How far can faith adapt to culture without losing its soul? That decision didn't just close China, it shaped how Christianity approached non-European cultures for centuries. Missionaries who came after wrestled with the same question: which cultural practices can Christians keep, and which must they abandon? In 1939, 235 years later, Pope Pius XII quietly reversed Rome's position. Chinese Catholics could participate in civil ceremonies honoring ancestors and Confucius. The Vatican acknowledged what the Jesuits had argued, that cultural context matters, intent matters, and the same ritual can honor heritage without dishonoring God. But the reversal came generations too late. By 1939, Christianity in China was marginal, suspect, associated with foreign colonization. The lesson was learned at a catastrophic cost. When cultural practices and Christian convictions collide, how do we discern faithfully before the price becomes unbearable? The wound left a scar. Today's global church still wrestles with the same tension. From Africa to Asia to Latin America, believers navigate cultural accommodation daily. When does honoring tradition become compromising truth? When does defending doctrine become cultural imperialism? The Chinese Rites Controversy stands as both warning and lesson for every missionary, every church planter, every denominational leader facing that question now. Modern missionaries study the controversy as a case study in cross-cultural ministry ethics. Mission agencies, they train their workers to discern the difference between cultural practice and spiritual compromise. Theologians debate whether Rome was right. Some argue the ban preserved doctrinal purity at a necessary cost, and others believe that the Jesuits understood Chinese culture better than the Roman theologians ever could. What's undeniable, though, is this: the stakes are human, not just theological. Whole communities can be lost when the church confuses its cultural preferences with God's unchanging truth. Entire generations can be alienated when it compromises that truth for acceptance. The controversy reminds the global church that culture sensitivity matters, but so does worship that belongs to God alone. Rigid gatekeeping loses cultures, but reckless accommodation, well, that loses the gospel. Both extremes lead to disaster. The question hasn't changed in 300 years. Where does cultural respect end and spiritual compromise begin? Neither has the cost of getting the wrong answer. The Chinese Rites Controversy teaches modern Christianity that wisdom requires humility, discernment, and courage to walk the narrow way between extremes, because the door that slams shut may stay closed for generations. And that struggle belongs to us now. Every believer faces the same crossroads. How do we live faithfully in a culture that doesn't share our convictions? Do we adapt to reach people, or do we stand firm even when it costs influence? The answer, it's not simple, and pretending that it is means that we haven't wrestled honestly with the question. Both extremes lead to disaster. Cultural sensitivity does matter, but worship that belongs to God alone matters too. Seeing only one side leads to loss. So, what does faithfulness really look like? It starts with humility, admitting that we don't always know where the line is. It continues with discernment, studying Scripture, seeking the Holy Spirit, asking hard questions. It requires courage, honoring culture without worshiping culture, standing for truth, even when it costs friendships and influence. Before you adopt a tradition, a trend, a value from your culture, ask, does this point people toward Jesus, or does it point people away from Jesus? Does it honor God while respecting culture, or does it dilute truth for acceptance? And when you stand firm on conviction, ask yourself, am I defending the truth, or am I defending my comfort? Ask yourself, am I protecting the gospel, or am I protecting my preferences? The narrow way isn't rigid fundamentalism. It isn't cultural surrender either, though. It's walking with Jesus in the tension, loving people enough to enter their world and loving Him enough never to compromise His lordship. So ask yourself today, where am I bending to fit in where I should stand for Jesus? And where am I standing rigid when I should really bend with grace? Walk the narrow way. Let conviction guide you. Let compassion steady you. Trust that the Lord who numbers every culture also redeems every culture. When his people follow him faithfully into the hard places where answers aren't easy and the cost isn't small, he's there, even when the answer isn't clear. If this story of ancestor altars and the gospel boundaries stirred or strengthened you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Make sure you go to thatsjesus.org for other Coach episodes and resources. And don't forget to follow and like and comment and review and subscribe and tune in for more Coach episodes every week. Every episode dives into a different corner of church history, but on Fridays, we do stay between 1500 and 2000 AD. Thanks for listening to Coach, where church origins and church history actually coach us how to walk boldly with Jesus today. I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Have a great day and be blessed. You know, after researching this episode, I tried to sum up this Chinese rites controversy with one sentence. Basically, it's this: nobody listened and everybody lost. And that about sums it up. This one was a hard episode to make because there's really no answer. It's just history, and it's something we have to contend with today. Have a great day. Be blessed.